Hello and welcome to the Focusing Way podcast. I'm your host, David Battistella. Today on the Focusing Way podcast, Robert Lee, PhD, is a focusing innovator. He's an international leader in developing focusing trainers. He led the Advanced Certification Week-long at the Focusing Institute in New York for 7 years. A licensed psychologist, Lee has developed a new model for teaching focusing called domain focusing. And he has developed a theory and practice for overcoming stubborn problems, changing the unchangeable through domain focusing, also known as macro shifting. He has developed a comprehensive practice for working with difficulties in felt sense formation, elusive felt sensing. In psychotherapy, he's developed special methods for using focusing with anxiety and depression, and with couple and group psychotherapy. And joining me now is Robert Lee. Robert, thank you for being here with me today.
It's great to be here and with people listening.
Yeah. So I just sort of want to begin because I'm very curious about domain focusing. And I'd just like to begin by asking, how did domain focusing sort of begin, or how did it evolve or form?
Well, I was teaching in a changes group in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was very unusual. The training and focusing would happen in the group. And I was teaching there, and I got into it and started teaching more. And one of the things I noticed is that some people would just seem to know what felt sensing was, and they could stay there quite easily. And then another group of people could stay there with reminders, and then another group of people really found it quite a mysterious place. It was like, what is it? And this would sustain over time. So I became very interested in helping group 2 and 3 differentiate felt sense from thinking, from using the word feel. Many people in those groups that had more difficulty would think that all they have to do is say, I feel that you are manipulating me, and they, as long as they used the word feel, they were into felt sensing. Or if they got emotional and said, I hate this, or I hate that, or I'm very sad about this or that, that felt sensing was the same as emoting or emotional expression.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I really do appreciate the necessity of people doing emotional work, either learning to express or learning to contain, and some people have to do both.
Mm-hmm.
I've had to do both for sure. But really, felt sensing is different than those. And so I started out sitting in a chair as a listener, and one chair would mean I think you're in the thinking domain. You might be emotionally expressing, but you're not in felt sensing yet.
Mm-hmm.
And only moving to the felt sensing chair when they would find a way to get themselves into felt sensing. So it was like a reward if I moved into the felt sensing chair as a listener, and it didn't interrupt things. So that was how I initially got into it. It was just wanting to to help this feedback loop for for the people who needed some help in finding the felt sense. And then the third domain of self empathy came because when some people aren't able to continue entering the felt sense, or they can't get a felt sense, what do they do? It's kind of like, well, if you're focusing, that's the end of the story or something. You can have methods to try and help them get that, but if they keep not getting it, if you say, what's it like inside? And they say, well, I have a stomach and I have muscles and I have an esophagus,
Hmm.
it, which I really have lots of experiences that way. But so what I found is that you could work on self empathy when felt sensing was blocked, and that it was an alternate way into the implicit. And so it was just wonderful. It would mean, oh, no big deal if felt sense is not opening right now. You can go this other way in. And so, and eventually I developed the theory that actually felt sensing implies sufficient self empathy. So that the people um, who aren't able to find a felt sense often have not much self empathy, or at least not much self empathy for experiencing, is maybe a better way to say it. So that was how they came. It was all pragmatics. Um, yeah.
So it sounds like you were sort of in the process of discovering different types of focusers or people who would need different entry points into process. Can you describe what that was like as you were sort of discovering that?
Well, it was exciting and frustrating, but really interesting over time, I would say. Like in the early days of teaching, uh, I would be so excited about what we would call natural focusers. Oh, wow, this person just has it all. But eventually, I found natural focusers had their own dilemmas,
Right.
and also that sometimes they wouldn't stay interested in the focusing process as well as this middle group that could develop focusing pretty well, but didn't already have it. So a lot of the best people at focusing would come not from the so-called naturals, but from this middle group. And so that was really quite. That's just an example of how interesting it was. And then later on, I developed a comprehensive method for people who have ongoing difficulty with felt sensing. And I did that because I thought our whole movement was diminished if it became more of a type.
Hmm.
If certain types, if some Jungian type or would be able to felt sense, and some other type wouldn't be able to, the Myers-Briggs type thing and stuff. I thought our whole theory is diminished if it's not a universal kind of thing that we can find. So so I developed a whole approach to when there's difficulty in the felt sense forming, and there were like 7 or 8 major strategies for what you could do, and I would do small group sessions with people. And it was fascinating because you had people who had gone through whole 2.5 year training programs. You would typically have a person who just long term had a hard time finding the felt sense. And when I started having them in a little group and working with them, it was fascinating because they would have a shift. I would do all this work towards finding a felt sense. And sometimes they would, but sometimes by the time we got to the felt sense clearly forming, there would be a major shift. So who cares or something.
Right, right.
So it was quite interesting that work and it was challenging, but people were mostly ashamed or something or embarrassed that they had studied so long and it was still hard for them. So I worked a lot to disarm this shame and just make it one of the normal patterns and things like that. So
That reminds me of a time, years I spent as an actor and training as an actor. And one of my teachers, when new students would come to the class, it was kind of intense method, but I wouldn't say it was just method acting. And if many of the new students were fresh out of drama school, and they had just completed a 2 or 3 or 4 year program in drama, and then needed to sort of enter the world of being an actor or working actor. And he would describe those first 6 or 8 weeks with those students as deprogramming, like that they had sort of brought so many expectations. But I mean, I don't want to draw the exact parallel. It just sort of reminded me of that period, or also that the thing of like the focus or the person, the wanting to sort of have something happen, and the patience that's required in a practice and in a process. It sounds like you were sort of, and when you talked about natural focusers versus those who sort of worked through everything more methodically, I could see that maybe a natural focuser might think, well, this is really easy. This is not a big deal. But it's actually the layers that become where the sort of the gold is in focusing, if we want to call it that. But that sort of, maybe that leads to me asking you about microshifting.
Well, let me just lead up to microshifting with one thing more about finding felt sensing. People come to felt sense from whatever they already know. So in your story, if they're coming from one kind of training into another kind of training, they're bringing this along with them. So if you come from doing a lot of visualization, you will be using that. If you come from doing a lot of emotional expression work, you will use that. If you come from acupuncture or body work, you know that will be the thing that is similar, and that will be your lead into focusing. But then for really strong felt sensing, at some point, and it often takes 3 or 4 years, I would say, for people who are continually studying, to begin to differentiate felt sense from the things that came before, from the things that seemingly made it easy to get into felt sensing. At some point, you need to get some differentiation from those, and that's really interesting. So So let me go to micro shifting. Um, so in the changes group that I started in Cambridge, Mass, I'd had focusing contact with Jinlin and letters and other experiences, but this was when in '86 when I really started practicing focusing every week. Maybe it was '87,
Mm-hmm.
and and I went to this group religiously every week, and you get to know people, and you're trading with people, and you kind of follow their process. And I noticed after a couple of years that one or two people out of this group of maybe 15, uh, one or two just made incredible change. There was this person with major depression that if you really listened to her empathically, you could almost not stand up after you were done. It was so exhausting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and she just moved out of that. It was like just incredible. Um, and then other people would kind of get caught in some resentment, and 3 years later, they were still focusing on that resentment or something. So it it was it was there that I got interested in who makes more fundamental change and who is kind of using focusing for a weekly problem or a monthly problem, and sure they get help with that. Um, but what's the difference? How do you make the deep change? So I got interested in that,
Mm-hmm.
and I titled something. It was a popular title. I titled it "Changing the Unchangeable." And in the mid '90s, and started having retreats on that. Uh, and then later, I went to Jinlin's first TAE workshop, and I began building the theory or pulling theory out of the different methods I developed. And that was when I made this distinction between the deep change, which I call macro shifting, and the regular change, which I call micro shifting. And over the years, I've learned that people will begin to think that micro shifting is unimportant or small, and it isn't like that at all. A micro shift, you might go to therapy for 3 years and things kind of get progressively better, and then your problem is solved, and then you stop. And it's a tremendous kind of experience. But I might call that, or the person might end up calling it a micro, because micros have a steadiness to them in their change. They take one little step and then another little step, and then the steps accumulate, and then finally after a while there's a big change, and the whole process is pretty straightforward and relatively continuous.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, whereas macros, you start and nothing happens despite great effort, or you get somewhere and then you find yourself back at the beginning, or you think you've shifted it and suddenly there's a recurrence of the whole difficulty, and you're back. It's really discontinuous because it's really going much deeper into your psyche.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to say, like economics, microeconomics and macroeconomics are both hugely important, and I do think that's true for micro shifting and macro shifting. Micro shifting is the stuff that that change is more predictably both in focusing but also in psychotherapy.
Okay.
Okay, and
Mm-hmm.
there are a ton of things that really are responsive in psychotherapy, and macro shifting is the kind of deeper character change that even when you're paying for really good weekly or twice weekly psychotherapy does not necessarily occur.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and not nor in focusing. It just really is. It's a real bear to get this deeper change in your core psyche to happen. So that's the difference in micro and macro shifting. And focusing partnership is tremendous in especially in micro shifting and giving an alternative to therapy. You learn how to do focusing and you can do this process. And it's not as predictable, it's not as safe as psychotherapy, but on the other hand, it's not costing you money and you're listening and learning how to listen. And so it's but it really is a wonderful addition, the micro shifting of focusing partnership. But focusing partnership does not usually bring macro shifting. I would
Mm-hmm.
say it's
Mm-hmm.
unusual. This person with the major depression, you could probably say that was a macro shift, and I'm sure she had psychotherapy going too. But that anyway, that gives you a little bit of a sense of micro shifting and macro shifting.
While you were describing micro shifting, I was sort of getting this image of a time lapse of a flower opening. It's like you sort of see one thing moves and then another thing moves and then another thing moves, and then over time you get this flower at the end of it, like something has opened. And there's something beautiful about witnessing a process like that over
Mm.
time. That's just, I was just sharing sort of what image that micro shifting came as you were describing that. But the macro shifts, you just mentioned right there at the end that they probably require some more help or more support or a different process. And I'm wondering if this is a good time to sort of talk about three-person focusing and these sort of longer sessions. The 3-hour, three-person session, is that designed to be more of a sort of a macro shifting kind of? First, maybe you could describe that a bit, and then let me know if I'm correct in suggesting that is sort of an environment for macro shifting.
It is quite that, and I actually want to. Let me just take this in for just a moment here to hold. I really liked your time lapse camera for the micro process. I'm going to remember that one. And in macro shifting, I'm just starting back earlier, and I'll come to the three-person. Actually, when you start to have things moving, which can take a ton of work, I actually start using what I call a safety protocol because you know the concept I have of macro shifting is that it is of an iceberg, and that we have to get the whole iceberg to move, but we only see the part above water.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to find a way to get to know the underneath, and it's the underneath that is difficult to take along. And so actually, when you get some very strong movements forward with macro shifting, you can get problems. Something in basic structure is trying to change or move. So it's actually a time to be more careful, which
Mm-hmm.
is just very different from micro shifting. Um, so I just wanted, that was just so nice to be able to say from your your flower, and then the way the macro just has this paradoxical, everything's going great, watch out,
Right.
you know,
Right.
kind of thing. Now, the 3-person 3 hour is actually good for micro shifting also.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really one of these innovations where I just was not organizationally strong and able to organize large workshops so well, or I just wasn't, I didn't, it wasn't in my personality type, but I could organize small groups, so I created this 3-person or 4-person kind of group, and I did just hundreds of those in New York City, and
Mm-hmm.
I taught the regular 10-person workshop type things also, but then I discovered that the people who were doing the 3-person sessions, often they would also be enrolled in the series of workshops and trainings. But the people who were doing the 3-person work would really learn domain focusing much better.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got pretty interested in that, and I started building it in more. Um, and let me say what in these sessions, there would be some theme, some exercise kind of thing, but then the majority of the session was intensive, where I would guide each person for 30 to 40 minutes. And while I would guide them, I would move between the chairs representing the domains. So if I were linking from thinking to felt sensing, I might start in the thinking chair and say, as you hold that migraine headache frequency that you've been having, as you hold that, you're not having it right now, but you've been having it the past few weeks, and you move to your experience. What's it like in your body right now? What's it like in your mood? That's a domain linking from thinking to felt sensing. So I would literally move chair right there. So the witnesses and the person I'm working with and even myself would really feel the difference between thinking, telling a story,
Mm-hmm.
and really looking for the felt sense. Yeah, it was so, and I also just decided that I would really give myself the freedom to guide frequently. So I developed many ways for entering each domain, and so I would always reflect and be an empathic, as we do in partnership. I was very committed to that.
Mm-hmm.
But then I would try and sense how it could go further, and I would make a suggestion or a question. And sometimes, I might make 20 of those in 30 minutes. I mean, there was a lot of guiding, And then we would be talking about it afterwards, the witnesses and we would be talking, what happened? How do we understand this? And the person who had done the work, the client, would say, but you didn't make any suggestions.
Wow.
And what it meant is that what I discovered in how I teach guiding is you need, if the suggestion is coming directly out of an empathic reflection, it doesn't feel intrusive. It doesn't feel like it's from the outside. It feels naturally emerging. So there isn't this kind of a jolt.
Yeah.
So this process just kept getting stronger and stronger. And then for people who came to macro shifting retreats, I would do breakouts, and then I would take 3 people with me, and I would do kind of a faster version of this process. And then I even came up with another version or adaptation for that. But so everyone would be getting this kind of 3-person guided work during the retreat. And it would really help things along. It would, there would be things I would teach and I would demonstrate, and then people would do partnership. But it's like, oh, did I do that? Did I get it? But then when they're with me or one of my colleagues that knows how to do this, then you can really just guide them right into it, so that oh, that's what we're trying to do there. Like this safety protocol, you might say, is there a way to move forward on your social contact? Someone's working on that and it's starting to move without getting sick. Because what we've figured out in the macro work is that when they start to get the social thing going forward, there's some kind of sick process comes up. And so when you begin to ask this question, you're holding the whole inner conflict that you've discovered. And if it's a good question, the person really goes into a deep pause, and that tells you it was a good question.
Right.
And it's very interesting work there. So then I kept looking at both how to sustain macro works. I had the 4-day retreats very early, but I didn't exactly know how to sustain the work. And then when I started doing the 3-person groups online, it meant that people could come to a retreat and then they could sustain the work in these 3-person, 3-hour groups where I'm guiding each person directly. So it just evolved that those groups would happen monthly, and then people would do partnership with the other people in the group in between, so that also the partnerships were informed by what happened. If you made a breakthrough in that 3-person session, your witnesses were in on that, and so it's being held in an implicit way, and you build further from it. So it's become quite important in the whole macro shifting process as this way that things can keep moving forward, especially in this way that macros can defeat us. That they're not simple. So we like need a little extra support or a little extra sophistication or something like that.
So when you're talking about those macros and you just mention them as something that can defeat you, can you just describe the kinds of things you're working through? A few examples of what typical macros are, if there are typical macros?
Well, it's yeah, I can. They're not exactly typical macros. I
Right,
mean, you
right.
would think there are, but instead, I have like 9 areas that it helps people to look in this area to find a macro. So I define macros as something you've tried to change several times and you've failed.
Okay. Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
and then the B of this definition is very important. And given your other accomplishments in life, it's not clear why you failed.
Mm.
So let me just give you the counterexample. If someone says that they announced they were running for president of the United States, and they failed, they didn't get any votes or anything, uh, that would not be a macro unless they had become a U.S. senator and several other things, and given their other accomplishments, you could see how this might happen. But so it eliminates just things that we tried to achieve. I want to become a great novelist, but I haven't written any short stories or I haven't studied writing
Right,
or something,
right.
So it's not surprising if you fail and you haven't accomplished or done work or something like that. Um, though I do want to also say in the artist world, it's quite interesting who really makes it. Okay,
Yeah.
because like I remember when Tracy Chapman was just singing in coffee houses in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And then she made it big time. And so everyone started saying, we knew she was going to make it, but no one said that before.
Right.
She was just go singing in coffee houses, getting a tiny bit of money. So it's really quite an interesting thing in the whole artist world, this very fine line between who achieves a certain kind of recognition and who doesn't. So, and it's not so straightforward, given what you've done, you should have it. It's a special case. But I'm diverging here. Sorry.
Yeah,
I
no.
just heard about your acting experience and it made me think of that special. So more what I would say, so one of the areas is mental health. So obviously obsessive compulsive disorder is famous for not getting cured, and there are exceptions to that. I had one exception that's very interesting and all that. But typically it has very low cure rate, and so you can almost be sure that it's always a macro, and schizophrenia is like that. Um, Bipolar, is a funny thing. They're typical people who have bipolar who have very successful careers and they find a way to manage it. But you also have lots of others who don't. So those are. I'm just mentioning. Major depression is a real bear for everyone. But this is those are mental health things that would floor anyone, and people work on them for 10, 20 years in psychotherapy and they don't conquer them. And it's not that the psychotherapy was bad, it's just they're very, very hard to change. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
we haven't figured out how to do it yet. Um, but there are also things that are easier that become macros for someone. I like to use the story of Gene Ginlin and smoking that
Mm-hmm.
I heard. I don't know this is, and I got some confirmation, but I'm not sure it's true. That you can just take this as one of the stories out there that's interesting. But that he had great difficulty quitting smoking. You could say that given his other accomplishments in life, which were incredible and amazing, this is not characteristic. So it would exactly fit a macro. All a macro means is, you know, is that something you're working on is hooked into this understructure, which is very hard to change. And
Mm.
so it can be something that for someone else is minor. Millions of people stop smoking, you know,
Right.
but Gene Ginlin did not really achieve that, to my knowledge. Um, so, uh, so in mental health, you have this mix of things that everyone would say, well, that's a macro for sure, and other things you wouldn't think they're a macro, but someone goes to therapy, they have a good therapist, and it doesn't change. And that tells you this is more complicated. This is, uh, got these deep links into your psyche and stuff. And the same is true with physical health. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
um, and it's a little different. You could say that any physical problem that medicine does not know how to heal, and there are a ton of those, um, is a macro, just because for our purposes, we're trying to reach an impact on this physical level that is difficult to reach. So I have lots of successes in in people working on physical problems where the medical approaches are not so um, satisfying, and it's really quite interesting. And it's not that the macro shifting focusing work is changing your cells so that there's no more scar tissue there. It's often that it can be that, but it's often that the macro work supports your intuition toward finding something either within straight medicine that's not so well known or within alternative medicine. Uh, there's just so much out there that isn't well known, and people start looking, and if they follow their intuition and their inner knowing, it's just quite something what happens there.
Mm.
So, um, so physical health is another area. Relationships, there's so many kinds of relationships. There's our parental and their parents, there's our children, there's our grandparents, our grandchildren, our siblings, our friends, our professional colleagues, but you also have work structures, where someone is your direct boss or they're just higher than you in an organization in some way that has some authority or some prestige over you. And that might be a problem. Or the ones under you might be hard for you to relate to or something. And people have tremendous, so there, and then coupling, I've got a whole special method on coupling that's really
Mm-hmm.
exciting because it's so different from everyone who comes to me for couple work, they just say, they've seen 4 other couple therapists, and they always say, this isn't at all like those others. So I'm always kind of thrilled by that comment, and I do get it often. So I won't go through all the 9 areas, but a very small habit. Someone can have a habit of stroking the hair of their partner the way they stroke the hair of their mother.
Mm.
And it can be habitual in a way that bothers the partner.
Mm.
And that just, but not a major obstacle to relating. But when someone goes in to try and change a little habit that's not a terribly big deal, they can find that it goes very, very deep into their psyche, and it's very challenging to change. So I always say to people, they get to decide what is their macro. They name it in several ways. The defining of it's a big, important process. But all I say is micros change more easily and macros change with more difficulty. And but it's your definition of those things that's important, because all it means is that macro tells you do a lot of other things because this is going to be challenging, and micro says just keep working and it's probably going to unfold. So you get to decide kind of how you want to define it to some extent.
You've been listening to The Focusing Way podcast, available on iTunes and Stitcher. I'm your host, David Battistella. Please visit our website at thefocusingway.com.